Hello, and welcome to our special edition series, SDGs and What You Need to Know. Together, we will be explaining and discussing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our mission is to educate everyday citizens about SDGs, what they are, what they mean, how the laws and policies that are and have been passed can and will affect us, not only here in Canada, but around the world. Additionally, by learning and understanding these 17 goals, we can all become one step closer in helping to affect change in this world from a grassroots perspective. My name is Kelsey from Saskatoon, along with Dave and Richard. We are Acres of Truth. Joining us is our special guest, Mark, who has been talking about the agenda for 20 years now. Welcome, gentlemen.
Greetings, Kelsey. It's Dave from Winnipeg, Ag Specialist.
Greetings, Kelsey. My name is Richard, and I'm a farmer from southern Saskatchewan.
Hi, Kelsey, Dave, and Richard. It's Mark here from Saskatoon, Director and Founder of the Forum for Canadian Sovereignty.
Thank you, gentlemen. The format of this series is for us to read the SDG, discuss the targets, and break it down for people to understand. I'm going to read the first SDG, which is number 1, no poverty. Eradicating extreme poverty for all people everywhere by 2030 is a pivotal goal of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Between 2015 and 2018, global poverty continued its historical decline, with the poverty rate falling from 10.1% in 2015 to 8.6% in 2018. Nowcasts suggest that owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, the global poverty rate increased sharply from 8.3% in 2019 to 9.2% in 2020, representing the first increase in extreme poverty since 1988 and the largest increase since 1990, and setting back poverty reduction by about 3 years. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic reversed the steady progress of poverty reduction over the past 25 years. The unprecedented reversal is being further exacerbated by rising inflation and the impacts of the war in Ukraine. It is estimated that these combined crises will lead to an additional 75 million to 95 million people living in extreme poverty in 2022, compared with pre-pandemic projections. I'd like to turn over the mic to Mark at this time to begin our discussion. Welcome, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, it's really important for people to understand that number one, end poverty, is part of the much larger goal of the overall Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is part of the much bigger redistribution of wealth scheme that they've come up with, the architects of this agenda have come up with. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the overall agenda in its full form, all 17 goals, 169 targets, 239 indicators, is to hyper-centralize governance, to hyper-centralize control of the world's resources, including food, and to hyper-centralize control of the masses, controlling all aspects of everyone's life. That's the ultimate goal, along with population reduction is also a stated goal of this overall agenda in and of itself as a whole. Now, obviously, ending poverty plays into the redistribution of wealth. So where does the world's wealth reside primarily? Throughout the Western world. So we need to figure out ways to suck as much wealth out of the first world, turning the first world into a second world, potentially a third world, nation states. So we're all equal. So we're all equally poor. So we're all equally dependent on this global governance model. And so we're all much easier, because we're dependent, because we're maybe even desperate, we need the warm embrace of global governance. This is ultimately what their agenda is. And there's obviously policy, there's obviously bills being passed, there's being money sent to, for example, the Ukraine, to be siphoned from there and spread throughout the world, maybe into the UN, into UN projects. It's all funding mechanisms up to and including even CO2, climate change, carbon tax, carbon pricing. There's a document that I discovered back in 2012 where it clearly states that they're using carbon tax and carbon pricing to raise money to be able to address the budgetary problems they're having with sustainable development. So it's a funding mechanism. It has nothing to do with saving the planet from CO2 or climate change. And so all of this is relative to goal number one, which, it looks like it's we're doing good. We're leaving people from poverty. But at the end of the day, at what cost? The cost of Western civilization, the cost of the first world being reduced to a second or third world. And so we're all equal. And this goal of achieving equality, and we'll get into that in goal number 10, is all relative to this. So I'll let the other two gentlemen speak to this goal as well, but I just wanted to give it an overview.
Yeah, that's good points, Mark. They're literally spending billions of dollars to facilitate all these goals, which sound like really good things to do, right? But as you said, the child tax, benefit, right? They're putting an extra 25 billion over 5 years. Was one thing that I read that they were doing in the goals, and then the guaranteed income supplement, like it's literally billions of dollars, which I encourage everyone to read it. And the links will be provided, and it's costing billions of dollars. Well, the thing is that's exactly what it does. Is it actually consumes wealth and makes us less wealthy. It doesn't actually accomplish anything for the poor. It makes us all poorer, is what happens. The government just can't understand that basically for them to be wealthy, if they let us prosper, we actually meet those goals on our own by basically, fixing up our own houses, by making it more efficient, buying newer vehicles, which are more efficient, and the government would get more money because, we pay more taxes because we're making more money, but they just don't seem to understand that. But I think Dave can talk more on that, right?
Yeah. So to your point, Richard, as of about 2000, Canada has been in large part, the globe has been reducing overall poverty by 1% per year. So we've been reaching major milestones. We've decreased poverty from 9.3 to 8.4 in 2019. The post-pandemic has blown this way out of proportion. This has skyrocketed, putting hundreds of thousands of people back on subsidy and, into food banks. The one thing that we were already doing is fixing the problem of hunger. And one of the best ways that we can solve hunger is to empower people. Most people want to work for a living and sustain themselves and their families. They are not looking for a government handout. But the last 2 years have taught many that, and created a reliance on that government handout, where they're sitting at home, they're idle, they're not doing anything, suicide, depression, those numbers are all skyrocketing because people are feeling defeated just from sitting at home and collecting thousands of dollars in checks. And these thousands of dollars are costing Canadians up to $5 billion per year. That number is continually growing. And if in my situation here in Manitoba, our federal debt is at almost $18,000, further a provincial debt of another $16,400. So myself and my family each are responsible for about $36,000 of debt. And if Saskatoon, it's a little less. You're 23,600, Calgary 27,000, St. John's 47,000. These debt numbers are spiraling out of control, and it will take decades if we can even turn that around.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned this because there's a lot of people that are confused, and they think that we should be focusing on inflation. They think we should be focusing on the economy, and they're not wrong. But people have to understand that all of these issues surrounding inflation, cost of living, the economy, it's all relative to this agenda. It's the commitment by our establishment governments over decades to this agenda that has created the inflation that we're going through. It's created the economy swirling the toilet bowl. It's because of this agenda, and people need to understand. I get it that your soccer moms in Toronto think about inflation and they think about the economy. I get that. I understand that. But if they only knew and they only understood that the root cause of this inflation is the globalist agenda, is globalism, while we send billions overseas and funding the Ukraine war that very much was avoidable, all of these things are connected, and people need to understand that. And it's our job to ensure that they understand this, that they understand why there's cost of living has gone through the roof, why inflation is where it's at, and why the economy is in such terrible condition right now. Again, it's all relative, and we need to make those connections and connect the dots for people. So while the goal in and of itself, end all poverty sounds wonderful, but at what cost? Are we going to destroy Western civilization where most of the world's wealth has been created that actually enables us to feed the rest of the world? Are we going to cut that off at the knees because this goal sounds so nice? I don't think that's achievable. And you're 100% right. Humanity has always been able, since the dawn of time, humanity has always been able to invent, to solve problems, to come to the table with ingenuity and solve these world problems. If left to our own devices, we can do this. We don't need some supranational entity dictating the terms of our life, all aspects of that life, in order to solve these problems. We need a free market. We need free market capitalism that encourages problem solving, creation, building, ingenuity, and all of these other things that we've shown, as you've stated, past decades, the improvement in people's lives around the world because of that ingenuity, those problem solving skills, the ability for humanity to solve these problems, these world problems. And we're moving in the right direction. We don't need a dictatorial entity telling us how to do this and destroying wealth at the same time. It goes against all things reasonable.
Absolutely. I think capitalism has been the way forward, and the free market has always dictated what the supply and demand curves are. Got our food costs right now today. And yes, there's inflation. Yes, there's higher taxes. But on top of all that, there's overinflated pricing. And we see it from big corporations, their profits to their shareholders, 10 to 14% higher than pre-pandemic. The reason you're paying higher costs for foods isn't just because of that inflation rate, which, the metaphor for calculating that have also been changed during the pandemic. And people need to be aware of that.
And you raise a very interesting point in all of this, because within this agenda, there are support mechanisms built in. And one of those support mechanisms is the World Economic Forum. And since 1971, since it was first founded by Klaus Schwab, they've worked very hard at developing partnerships with multinationals, oligarchs, monopolies, big tech, and they've all been promised that they will share in these record profits that we're seeing all of these multinationals and oligarchs and monopolies all share in. And of course, they are showing record profits. I mean, through the pandemic, it was small business, medium-sized business that suffered the most, while all of these multinational companies all recorded record profits through this experience. And they were all promised this as being partners to this agenda. And from this, of course, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, comes the ESG, right? It, environmental, social governance. And so all of these multinationals that have recorded record profits are more than happy to play along and to be a party to this and participate in this overall agenda. And I like to call that fascism. It's this idea where capitalism has taken, a lot of heat over the last decades, primarily from the left, it wrongly, because what we've been seeing for these last few decades has nothing to do with free market capitalism and everything to do with crony capitalism and this, governance to corporation partnership. And that's fascism. And this is what this whole agenda came together, was the convergence of communism and fascism working together to govern the planet. And so, really, that's what this is all about. And so you raise a great point in that.
Mark, I want to come back to that in a little bit here, but before we come back to that, I wanted to ask you one question, or a question to the three of you. One of the targets when I'm reading, and I put myself in the shoes of the listeners. You guys have been at this and researching this, and Mark, you've been talking about this for a very long time. But when somebody like me or listeners who are new to this and who are trying to understand this read a target or hear a target such as this, by 2030, eradicating extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. What does that mean, and how does that affect this overall goal for poverty reduction?
Yeah. So I mean, this is splitting some hairs ultimately, and this is what they want when they write these things down. They want people to look at things. They want people to be a little bit confused. They want people to be enamored with all the pretty words. But at the end of the day, ultimately, again, as a whole, this agenda is meant to create global governance. It's meant to control the world's resources, control people's consumption, how they consume, how things are distributed. They want control of all aspects of everyone's life. And that's how I look at this. That's how I approach this. All of the the targets that they list and the indicators that they list is all fluff. It's really, at the end of the day, none of what they say they're going to do through this agenda is actually in reality achievable. They're not going to achieve it because money doesn't grow on trees. Wealth isn't created by stamping out capitalism. That it's not how it works. In fact, it's the opposite. And we've seen totalitarian, authoritarian states throughout history eat themselves because their economy is in tatters. There's nothing there. They're not producing anything. They're not creating or building anything. They're literally dying is what happens. And so all of these targets and all of the indicators is just a whole lot of fluff trying to bolster the narrative around this overall agenda. And unfortunately, it works with politicians because it sounds pretty, and politicians don't want to necessarily be labeled as opposing something that sounds so wonderful.
Yeah, and part of the targets, it goes into housing and a whole bunch of stuff, Kels. It goes into, providing housing and all this wonderful things. And instead of basically giving money or letting governments borrow billions of dollars to do this, I'd suggest a real solution would be each and every one of us look in your own community. Do you have somebody that's homeless? Do you at least have somebody in need? And, there's Lions Clubs, there's many different good organizations that, we could put our money to help our own people, our neighbors, and, community-wise and provincially wise. We don't need to give it to federal governments that, dictate that we should go all over the world. That's not a solution. That's a money laundering plan is what that is.
So up until 2015, 2016, from my perspective and my point of view, just being a regular citizen in our communities here in Saskatchewan and in the country of Canada, it seemed as though that is something that we were very proud of. Those are some of the things that we were working really hard as, contributing people in our communities to achieve those things, and that's, as a country, we were making a lot of progress in that area. So, why break, or when it's not broke, there's that saying, if it's not broke, you don't need to fix it. So what happened here? And speaking of totalitarian governments, the slippery slope that our government has done everything in their power to prevent us from questioning this agenda or even do a risk assessment. So given these roadblocks, for these listeners, what tools do we have at our fingertips? How can we help affect change? Like you said, Richard, at a grassroots level, and keep our voice relevant and heard, and simply put, how do we push back?
Well, Kelsey, I'll just throw this in there a little bit. And Mark alluded to a little bit of history. And history has always taught us that black markets emerge, arbitrage opportunities exist, and people will exploit them. Everyday common citizens are going to get very resourceful. They're going to bring new tools that perhaps haven't been used in decades or perhaps haven't been used before to circumvent the system. And it's by means of getting your car maintained. You're looking for some lawn care or some home repairs, those types of things. People are going to find their neighbors who they trust and forge relationships. And I kind of see this with the number of people that complied with the government mandates regarding the vaccine passports and those types of documents. There was roughly about 20% of the population that did not participate in that experiment. They were actually the control group. And we look at how successful they came out. Many of those came out unscathed. And so, to your point on the missions and the food, Canadians have always prided themselves with food distribution, looking or taking care of the downtrodden, the people that are down on their luck. And this system is designed to actually circumvent that, where it will actually exploit that beyond the capacity that it's able to carry itself. And thereby making the government look like the great savior of coming in and saying, yes, here's your monthly rebate check or your weekly check that you can go collect food stamps or collect it or change your food stamps into food by a list of preferred vendors and suppliers. And again, supporting the corporations who have signed up on this deal. It is not going to be supporting your mom and pops. It's going to be the big corps that are, or anyone who has signed up with this. And so we've seen that through banking sectors right now, where small businesses are encouraged to get in on banking using these preferred suppliers. And along with that comes extra revenue to implement some of these ESGs and the SDG program. So it's a big deal. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely correct. And it's interesting because, I've had a lot of years to think about this, and I actually, there's going to be a natural and organic response to this agenda, to hyper-centralization on a global scale. And the antidote really to all of this is self-reliance, self-determination, independence, and community. And you're going to see more and more people breaking away from the matrix and creating their own communities where they're developing relationships with farmers, with ranchers, with chicken producers, all of these food growers, and you're going to have this parallel society, I think, for a while until we get over this thing, and so it's going to be a natural progression away from this hyper centralization to radical decentralization. That's the antidote to all of this, and even especially when it comes to to food and community. Community has a really great way of looking after the people that are in need. And that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be government, the great nanny state, government dictating the terms to the people. It should be left to the community. The community needs to come together. And all of this, and we've seen it through a lot of our town hall events that we've been doing, is this coming together of community where people are developing networks and are coming together with food producers and different skills and developing these parallel systems. Even in healthcare, there's healthcare people that are coming together and want to offer an alternative to the mainstream healthcare or sick care that we like to call it. And so those things are happening naturally. And as this progresses, more and more of this is going to happen, because I think that's just a sense of humanity. I think that's natural for humans to break away from global tyranny or dictatorship, and black markets are created, as Dave mentioned, and so all of these things, I think, a lot of them will resolve themselves organically and naturally. Now, I'd like to have to avoid having to do all of that if we can, stop this agenda in its tracks in this country, and hopefully lead the world and get other, motivate and inspire other nations to say no to all of this hyper centralization. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, as we move forward, more and more, we're going to start being forced to develop our own communities and get outside of that matrix.
Well, so Mark, and to that point as well, people are going to realize that local dollars are able to stretch further and impact more
Yes.
people in a positive way. We look at how the abuse of power has come from our government and the squandering of money. We have millions, if not billions, of unaccounted dollars that were spent and are gone.
Yep.
I was speaking with a gentleman the other day who is an economist, and he struggled. I posed the question, is if Canada was getting 50 cents on the dollar of value. And he struggled to say that we're probably getting about 37 cents on the dollar. So for every
Right.
tax dollar Canadians are paying, 37% of it is actually going to something that is accounted for. The rest seems to go missing or is squandered and is just gone. And so how are we looking to, or how are society going to look forward to a government that promises to balance the budget and can't produce 37 cents on the dollar? Like, even some of the worst prime ministers have done better than that. And people need to recognize that we can get, in the high 80s, 90 cents on the dollar to where it needs to go. Organizations have proven that time and time again. And that's where we go
100%.
back to the grassroots. That's where we go back to people taking care of their people. They know where the problem exists, because Ottawa does not know what problem exists here in my city of Winnipeg or in my community.
No.
They have no concept of that, and
No,
nor should
100%.
they. It's not their job. But
Right.
We can do things on a local level, on a much smaller level.
Yeah, 100%. I think, just to end the discussion on this, on goal number one, ultimately, as I mentioned, it's about redistribution of wealth, destroying the first world, to make us all equal in second and third world standard of living. And do we all want to be equal? Did anybody in this country, first of all, was anybody in this country informed of this consequence? Did anybody vote on this? Did they want to see the destruction of their prosperity and their standard of living, dissolve to second, third world status? That's never happened. Nobody's ever had that discussion with their constituents. So ultimately, this is something that's been thrust upon us. We haven't voted on it. Nobody's been informed about it, other than a few people that have attended our town hall events. And so really, it's things like what we're doing in this space is educating people and letting people know what's really at stake and what's really coming down the pipe. So to wrap up goal number one, that's I think we can do that.
Yeah, I think so too, actually. And as we see moving forward into the you know, towards 17, I think a lot of the goals are, all it really does is empower themselves. And I think that's the whole goal is, but yeah, good points. I think we covered that one, unless you have any more questions, Kels.
No, excellent conversation and discussion, gentlemen. Thank you so much. That's a wrap, folks. You've been listening to an Acres of Truth special edition podcast series. We would like to thank you so much for joining us in this journey. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others on your social media platforms. Be sure to check out our website, acresoftruth.com, for more information on other podcasts and where you can find them. Additionally, feel free to send your questions or comments to info@acresoftruth.com. Thanks again for listening.